Wasn't guaranteed. If the people, let's put it a different way. The people that did not get it were guaranteed to die. And so what did they call this panel?
Death panel?
The God Committee. So there were two groups. One was doctors, and they would decide if your body was going to be suitable, for example, for the treatment. And this first panel of doctors would basically, rule you out if you were too old or if you were too young. And they had some other factors that were involved in this. But the God Committee was the second one. Do you remember who was in the God Committee? What's that?
Businessman.
A businessman was one of them. Who else?
A housewife.
A housewife was one of them. Who else?
A doctor.
There was a doctor that was involved.
A lawyer?
There was, I don't know if there was a lawyer, now that I think about it. But there were others, a religious figure, for example. Take a good look at that list of people that were on there. What would they vote on and decide? They would decide who gets the treatment. And what was the determining factor on whether somebody would get the treatment or not?
What they could
What they
provide.
provide to the society.
What was that?
What they provide to the
What they provide. What's another word for what they provide?
Their
the employment, yes?
Their what?
Employment or productivity?
Their employment was part of this, their social worth.
their worth.
Their social worth. So basically, they were going to be treating this as an investment. We are going to give you treatment if your social worth is good enough to justify it. So we talked about this, and I think I had given you the example of a soccer player, a prostitute, a teacher, these kinds of things. And the argument was that maybe the soccer player would be at the bottom of the list, because it's soccer. But maybe, in fact, the teacher would be at the top of the list because of the number of students that he or she could actually reach. So kind of keep that in mind. But take a look at these articles. The last one that was, and Status, by the way, believed in regulating the economy, but they did not believe in redistribution. So they were the exact opposite of the welfare state folks. So keep that in mind. And then the last one that was up here was actually the socialists. And the socialists believed in regulation and redistribution. Take a good look at that Rick Santelli article, because that's a really good example of this. And there was also the Rick Santelli video. This was the one where he called the people the losers that lost their home mortgages. So take a look at this. And when you look at these terms up here, anytime you can link them to an article, I would. Let me stress to you, the chapter questions are probably going to be about 20% of the exam. The articles are probably going to be closer to 40 or 45% of the exam. And then when we're running through here in terms of terms, and I'll make sure that I post some terms up there that kind of reflect what we're talking about so you can narrow it down. The terms are going to be that other 35 or so percent. So the biggest piece is going to be the articles, but make sure that you're clear with those. For ideologies, we defined ideology, and I think that's pretty straightforward if you go through it from the chapter. We talked about liberal and conservative right off. This was just from the other day. Do you remember the article that we used for liberal? Oh, shame. Oh, shame. The article that we used for liberal was actually that California tunnel article. And if you remember, the liberals typically believe that the glass is half full. The liberals have a confidence that government can get involved and make things better. And if you remember, they were trying to build a tunnel. They were trying to build a tunnel in the grand scheme of things. And this tunnel, if you remember, what was the problem with the tunnel? $90 billion?
It was next to the salt mine.
In California, but look at what happened last night. The train derailed and it went all in the water. That's not.
Okay, the expense of this is going to be a big deal. And was it $9 billion?
It was
Oh, no, 9 trillion.
It was $9 trillion?
Oh, Jesus.
It was 9 billion, right?
I think it was $9 billion over 25 years. What did you say, Malika?
It was next to like a fault line or something.
Yeah, it was next to a fault line that had a significant magnitude earthquake about 100 years ago. And there's two ways of looking at it. You could look at it and say, well, they haven't had an earthquake in 100 years, so maybe this is stable ground. Or you could argue they haven't had an earthquake in 100 years, so they're due, especially if you start going through and drilling underground. Why were they building this tunnel? they had traffic problems. And there was a number
yeah.
in there that talked about how much traffic the highway was built for and how much it was actually dealing with. They were talking about maybe building double-decker highways or an underground tunnel because they couldn't expand wider lanes through the mountain ranges, so they wanted to do something else. Take a good look at that. And the argument, I believe it was going to be like the second longest tunnel in the world. It was incredibly expensive, but you could argue it was incredibly stupid because they were going to build it right by a fault line. Make sure that you're comfortable with that liberal. Go ahead.
So that's an example of liberal because they think that the government can make the better decision.
It's an example of liberal because they believe that when government gets involved, they can make things better. And you could argue that it's a good example of liberal because it's the idea that the glass is half full and we can solve problems without making them worse. Of course, that tunnel collapses on that fault line, you're not going to have nearly as big of a traffic problem because you're going to have all these people trapped and killed, especially if it happens during rush hour. So you kind of get the idea. What was the example of the article that I had given y'all for conservatism? It was something that Alan would have been interested in.
Is this the fast food thing?
That's actually a different one, but Alan was interested in that. And it was a concept in there.
Oh, Soda de Blasio in New York?
That's not it either. It was
Okay.
actually the Jim Crow laws. You remember examples of the Jim Crow laws?
Yeah.
Take a good look at that article and make sure you're comfortable with those. To kind of go back to the outline, just for a minute here, because I know we're coming up on time, you take a look at this, and if you remember with the conservatives, they tend to believe that the glass is half empty, and that if government gets involved, it can make things worse. And a couple of those quotes that I had read to you basically said that we needed established institutions. So, for example, marriage is an institution. For example, churches are institutions. Or within the context of Jim Crow, segregation, slavery was an institution. And those old Jim Crow laws were designed to basically conserve what existed in terms of the social structure to separate white and black residents from a lot of the southern states. So make sure that you've got some examples of those Jim Crow laws. And let me stress to you, I'm not saying that liberals are all stupid because they want to build a tunnel by a fault line. I'm certainly not saying that all conservatives are racist because this was a good example, Jim Crow, of conserving what existed. But there is some element of both of these on this. Several of y'all had given me, you've given me several articles about the soda. Take a look at the soda article. I think I mentioned that in class, but I did not exactly go over it. In the soda article, they're talking about limiting the amount of ounces of soda that a person can buy at one time. This overlaps very nicely with that Big Mac article. And if you remember in the Big Mac article, and it's posted now, the Big Mac article was the idea that they wanted to limit the construction of fast food restaurants, especially in, I believe it was South LA, and I believe it was dealing with more minority communities. Alan got upset about it because of the racist element to it, but there's also an economic element and there's an obese element to it. So the Big Mac's article is up there, but both of these were examples of populism. The idea that government should help Joe and Jane Sixpack because government can make better economic and social decisions than people can make for themselves. Can you give me the other two examples that we talked about? Actually, the other three examples that we talked about that dealt with populism.
What's his name? TT and the Mohawk guy.
TT, and she was the HIV positive prostitute in Texas. Take a good look at that one. It was Wolf Hawk, and what was Wolf Hawk having problems with in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania?
He's a sex offender, had a baby.
He was convicted of double sodomy about 20 years prior with minors. And in fact, he not just was convicted, but I mean, he was imprisoned, he's out, he fathers a child, and what did the state do, the Commonwealth? They took the Commonwealth immediately and they did not grant him any visitation. And this is populism, the idea that you're trying to make decisions for people, in this instance a child that couldn't make or protect itself. The other piece to this, what was the third example that was kind of frivolous that y'all really hated? They wouldn't, but what was the other article, the third article? The hugs. What were the hugs, Kessie?
Oh, yeah.
Banned hugs in what state was this? Fine state of New Jersey. New Jersey was banning hugs. New Jersey was limiting the amount of time for hugs. And we talked about this within the context, and the article mentions this, of some of the problems with the school day. There was also a liability harassment issue. So you could maybe even get into a little bit of feminism with this hugs article if you chose, but it certainly deals with populism, to be sure. Again, making decisions for the people that maybe can't make them the best. You'll notice up here, Brittany Maynard was one that we talked about. Do y'all remember her?
Moved to Oregon, had the assisted suicide.
Yes, she was the one that had the terminal condition. She was, I think, 28 or 29 years old. This was basically a year and a half or 2 years ago. And she did go out there and she took a mix of chemicals voluntarily to end her terminal illness, to end the suffering that she was going through. Take a good look at that article. That one can probably fall under politics in a number of different ways. It probably overlaps with statism a little bit too, because it's the idea that if somebody cannot contribute and nobody can provide for them, that maybe they shouldn't be there. You could also make an argument, though, that she is making her own personal social decisions. You could maybe make an argument that that falls under libertarianism if you wanted to as well. So kind of keep that one in mind. Going back to the outline just a little bit, and you'll notice up here, populist. Nationalism we did not talk about, so I won't do anything with that. Obviously, we did deal with feminism today, and there were 2 articles that we dealt with specifically. Before I get into feminism, I will scan and post the results of the belief quiz today. Make sure that you're comfortable. When we were talking about that first one, government regulation and government redistribution, those 4 categories, welfare state and status and all that, make sure that you understand what the government role is between regulation and redistribution. Do they want to do it? Do they not want to do it? Do they want to do it sometimes and not other times? That's going to be part of the answer, and maybe give me an article example. For populist, libertarian, liberal, and conservative, same kind of thing. Know if the ideology wants to regulate bedroom or moral issues. Know if the ideology wants to regulate economic issues or wallet issues. If it wants to regulate both or neither, that kind of a thing. And make sure that you can give me examples of these. So we've talked about the conservative example, which was Jim Crow, the liberal example, which was the tunnel, the populist examples, we've got a lot of them in there. I don't know that we really had a libertarian example. Yeah, go ahead. Conservative was Jim Crow, the liberal was the tunnel article. And then we had about 5 articles that dealt with populism. So there's got to be questions about populism on the test. And then we didn't really have an article that dealt with libertarian. And then the other piece, or the last piece, is dealt with what we dealt with today, and that was feminism. And feminism is basically the idea of equal rights. The genders should be treated equally. And we had the 2 articles, one with Inez and one with Obama and basketball. And both of those we talked about probably equally. So since we just did them today, I won't say a whole lot. Let me again stress to you the breakdown on this. It'll probably be about 40 to 45% from the articles. It'll probably be about 20 to 25% from the chapter questions. And that other 30% or so is just going to come from the terms. And we dealt with terms as we were running through the outlines. I'm going to post some terms so that it's clear, but it's basically just going to be the stuff that we went through today. And I'll make sure that those terms are posted when I get to Rockville. So that'll basically be that. Do y'all have any questions?
Would the terms have like definitions with them?
Well, we just went through all the definitions.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's going to be stuff that's going to be on the tape. Yes? The questions that I'm talking about are going to be the questions that come right here at the bottom of the outline, yes. And actually, here we've got study terms. So this chapter at least has got some study terms up there. I'll probably throw, and it's got more too. Yeah, some of these. I wouldn't worry about social democracy because we never really dealt with that one. And understand anarchism as an extreme form of libertarianism. Communism is the extreme form of liberal. Dictator is the extreme form of populist. And of course, Nazi with conservative. So Anybody with any questions about these? I don't know that it's gonna be hard, it's gonna be thorough, and what I would say to you is, make sure that you can tell me the stories. Explain the facts when you write about an article. What I may also do is have bigger point value questions where you have to write about several articles, but look for commonalities and look for themes. And sometimes you might get a chance to write about articles from both of the two chapters, depending upon how I word the question. So I'm gonna put this in a way so that the more that you can explain to me, the better it's gonna